Oh, hey there. I'm so sorry. I really didn't see you there. I was enjoying these animations so much. I mean, look at them. Just, it feels so nice to have these scrolling animations on pages. Of course, they're not used for everything. You won't add them if you want to sell something in a web shop, for example, but for marketing pages to present new products, things like that, this is just so satisfying to watch. And that's exactly what I want to show you today. I want to show you how you can create a page like this with Framer Motion with not that much effort. Because adding simple animations is something you can do pretty quickly. But like always with animations and styling, the devil is in the details. So you can spend a lot of time really working on those details and making the animation perfection. If you, for example, take a look at this first animation where you scroll the image and it moves sideways but also scales up at the same time, the timing of this animation is just perfect and that makes it feel so smooth. But like with all things in life, it starts with knowing the basics, and from there you can iterate and make things even better. So what I did and what I want to take you through today is I took this website built by Code Sandbox about Code Sandbox projects, which by the way is an amazing tool. I took this and rebuilt it. I added in all of the styles with Tailwind, and that's not something we're going to discuss today. But what we're going to do is together we are going to add all of the animations. If we look at the end result that I built, it looks quite similar, and I hope with these basics you're actually able to build these kind of amazing products like the Code Sandbox project website yourself. So of course we are not going to start with a finished project that has all of the animations in there already. So let's switch back to a place where we don't have these animations. And that is this website. What you see here is only the hero component that has the main text. And if we look at Code Sandbox website, what happens if we scroll down is that this text scales down and fades out. And also the background fades away. Right underneath that main text is this image. That image fades in, but then also has quite a lot of different animations. If we take a look at our code, you see that I created an index page, that I added in this hero component, and that I also prepared a little bit for all of the other sections we're gonna build. Looking at this hero component, and everything already has some class names to look a little bit like the project's website. But the thing that's still missing here, of course, is the scroll animation. If we look at the website right now, there is fairly little room to scroll. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to enable this next section already. And the next section also gives us an image, but that doesn't do anything yet. However, having this image gives us a scroll bar and thus gives us some room to scroll. And if you are, by the way, wondering why this text remains in place when we scroll down, this is because this text has position fixed. So that way it always stays at the top of the screen. So for these animations, we are going to use Framer Motion. And in order to use Framer Motion, of course, you should also install Framer Motion. I already did this, but if you didn't do that yet, that's an important step to also take. Once you've done that, the next step is adding in an event listener to track the scroll position of the window. And for this, we can import a hook called useScroll from Framer Motion. And this hook we can then use within our component. This hook does accept an argument, and that argument first needs to get a target. And that target is the thing you want to track the scroll position within the window from. So in this case, that will be the full section. And in order to get some sort of reference to this div in React, you need to use the useRef hook. So that means that we're gonna define a target ref, and this ref we can then put as a ref on our section. And once we have done that, we can add this ref to the target as well. After we've added this target to the useScroll hook, it will return a variable called scroll_y_progress. And this variable contains a number between 0 and 1, which refers to how far the user has scrolled, where 0 is 0% and 1 is to the end of the current target. And once we have this value, we can use another hook by FramerMotion to calculate a different style based on this value. So the hook we need to use is called useTransform. So that hook transforms one value into another value. Might sound confusing, but if you look at how you use it, I don't think it's that confusing anymore. So let's say we, for example, want to fade out the full section once the section is scrolled out of view. We can do that by creating a new variable called opacity that uses the useTransform hook, and that then takes in 3 arguments. The first argument is the thing you want to transform from. In our case, it's the scroll progress. And then there's 2 more arguments it takes in, like Copilot already suggests. The first array is an array of values you want to map from. And the second array is an array of values you want to map to. So in this case, that would mean if we would use this example, let's autocomplete that for a second. That means that if the scroll y progress is 0, it would give an opacity of 1. If the scroll y progress is 0.5, it will use 0.5. If the scroll y progress is 1, the opacity would become 0. And any value that lies in between is automatically animated by FramerMotion. So in our case, I already played around a little bit with the animation, and what we want to happen is that around halfway of the scrolling position, we want the section to fully fade out. Now we have this, there's one more thing we need to add to our useScroll hook, and that is an offset. But in order to explain that, it's better to also look at the FramerMotion documentation. As you can see in their documentation, you see that it accepts 2 strings, both being 2 words. And if we scroll a little bit further down, we see that it describes a point where the target and the container meet. So start end would mean that the start of the target meets the end of the container. And now you're thinking, what's the target? What's the container? In our case, the target is something we have defined. That is our section. The container is something you can define in the hook as well, but if you don't do that, it's your current window. That would mean in our case that the start of our section, so the top part of the section, would meet the end of the window. And if the second value would be end, like you see here as well, that would mean that the bottom part of our section would meet the bottom part of our window. And any range that's between that's where the scroll y progress is applied on. So based on that, you can decide on which point of the scrolling position it should start animating. Should it as soon as it gets from the bottom part in the view, or should it only be a specific offset, maybe a few hundred pixels, or should it only count once it's at the end of the view? And to be honest, it's a bit hard to exactly know when to use any of these values. So you might have to play around with it a little bit to see when exactly what applies. But since there's only a few values you can use here, you get the hang of it pretty quickly. So most of the time, start end and then end start is probably the thing you're looking for. But let me tell you, in this case it's not, but let's first add the opacity so we can see what we're doing. This value doesn't only return a number, but it actually returns a lot more logic. So therefore, you don't just add this as an inline style or as a class name or something like that, but you actually have to use a custom component that FramerMotion creates for you. This custom component you can import from Motion, and then you can convert any element like section, div, paragraph into a motion.section. And if we only add that, nothing will happen. Everything will remain the same. However, we can now add in a style object. In there, we can define opacity to be equal to opacity or just opacity, because that's exactly the same thing. And what happens is you already saw that the section faded out. If we look and we inspect this section, we already see that the opacity of 0 is applied to it. And why does that happen? That is because the start of our section did already meet the end of our container, because the start of our section is at the top of the view and the end of our container is the bottom of our window. So it's already 100% past that. So most of the time when you're animating a component that's at the top of the page and thus always in view, it's actually not start end you're looking for, but end. Because this way, the end of the container would meet the end of the target. If we now start scrolling down, you see that it starts fading out. And if you also look at the inline styles here or here, you see that Framer Motion nicely updates this value. And as soon as we're halfway the height of this section, it's already gone. And that is because we specified the 0.5 in here. And the reason that this image sticks, even though it can scroll further down, is because this element uses position sticky. But that's something we will look at in a second. Because looking at Code Sandbox's website, next to the fading, you also see that it scales down. So that's also something we still have to add. And perhaps you already guessed it, for that we can create a new variable called scale. That's again useTransform. And that takes in the scroll Y progress. In this case, we also want to animate from the 0% to 50% of the height. And the scale we want to set is go from 1 to 0.8. However, we do not want to apply this scale to the section because that would scale everything down. And in our case, that would also include the background. So that would mean that you start seeing the gradient shrink as well, which is not something we want. So therefore, we need to turn this wrapper div that actually contains all of the text into a motion.div as well. And once we've done that, we can add the style attribute again and add the scale on there. What you just saw happening, or maybe you did not, is that as soon as I added this scale, the image moved from the center to the right. And the reason for that is because this image is position fixed with a left of 50%, but also a translate X of minus 50%. And that's done to center this image. However, as soon as I set this scale, and we can inspect this div as well, you see that in this case it's transform none, but as soon as we start scrolling down, you see that it adds scale. But this style isn't applied anymore because that's a transform that's only applied by this class. But an inline style will always override that. So that means that this style is now not applied anymore. However, we can add this to our style tag by just adding X minus 50%. And in this case, Framer Motion will add the minus 50% for us, and we can remove this class name. And once we've done that and start scrolling down, you see that it both fades out and scales down. And with that, with only a few lines, we already replicated the scrolling animation of the top section of the website. There's one more thing I still want to add, and that is that I actually want to remove the fixed attribute from this component, because even if you would scroll down, it would always lie on top. And that would make it very hard to interact with this page if there's something like buttons on there, or perhaps just text you want the user to be able to copy paste. So for that, I'm going to add another variable called position and also use the useTransform. We add in the scroll Y progress, but this time I'm not going to add an array. I'm actually going to add a small function. That function accepts a position, which is the value of the first array, a number between 1 and 0. And based on that, I can also return some styles. So that means that I can do something like return position is larger or equal to 1. And actually it can only be 1. So equal to 1 should also be okay. And based on that, I'm going to return relative or fixed. So that means that if the position is 1, it becomes position relative. And if it's smaller than 1, then it will stay fixed. So now we can copy this variable and add the position in here as well. And remove this class name. So if we then refresh and inspect this element, we see that the position fixed is added as an inline style. But if we scroll down far enough, you see that it becomes position relative. And this way, it's not lying over top of this image anymore. Beautiful, right? So now we have added in this first hero animation. Let's add in the animation for the image as well. If we look at Code Sandbox website and we scroll down, we see that this image scales up, but also kind of moves to the left. Then it stays in view, and then there is another image that fades in. Like you can see in the index page, I already created multiple components, and in my case, the collaboration component only contains this large image. The second image you see fade in is part of the same page component. So let's first see what that main image looks like. If we go to the collaboration component, we see again that it's pretty straightforward. There's a few wrappers in here, and the image, like I explained before, is position sticky. So if we scroll down, we see that it sticks to the top of the page. And the reason that I can keep on scrolling is because this component or this section has a height of 300 viewport height. So it's 3 times the height of my screen. And as long as there's room left to scroll, this image will remain sticky. And if we add content underneath it, it will scroll away. That is how position sticky works. So in order to have this image scale up and move to the left, we again need to add in our useScroll hook. So let's copy that from our hero component and also make sure that we import everything. And then I'm gonna add this ref to our div, because the height, the 300 viewport height, is the height we also want to use to run our animation over. So that's why this div should have the ref. And based on the scroll Y progress, I did define already 2 animations that I want to add. The first one is a scale animation, which runs from 10% in view to 40% in view to 95% in view. And that animates the scale from 1 to 2.5 times to again 2.5 times, which is actually not necessary. So we can just remove this. So that would mean that at 10%, it's still scale 1. So the first 10%, it will remain 1. Then at 40%, it will be 2.5 times its size. Then there's also a translate X, which goes from 0% to -55, very fast, because it does that in 15% of the scroll height. Then for 45%, it only moves 5% to the left. And then it speeds up a little bit again to -80. And like I said, defining those values, this is something that's the most time-consuming part of making these animations. And this is absolutely not the exact same animation that the Code Sandbox website uses, because that would mean it would take a lot more time to tweak these values to look exactly the same as Code Sandbox website. But enough talking, let's add these scale and transform X so we can see something happen. In this case, I don't want to scale the whole section and move the whole section to the left. I actually only want to move the image. So that means that I'm gonna change the scale and position of the wrapper of the image. So we have to make that a motion.image again. Sorry, a motion.div, of course. And then we can add the inline style attribute again, both adding the scale as well as the X. And then there's still one more thing we need to change, and that is that our animation should run directly from the start and not the end. And if we do that, we already see that our image starts to scale up and move. And if we inspect that, we again see that the inline styles are being added by Framer Motion. And this way we can scroll completely to the end of this div and the animation will just run like we defined it. And looking at Code Sandbox website, you also see that next to the scale, they also have some avatars pop in here and move around from the top bar to the left side of the editor. That's not something I decided to add because that would make this video way too big. But let me know in the comments down below if you would like to see a future video about specifically this type of animation. But before we get too carried away, let's actually add the next section. Because as soon as we scroll beyond this main image, we see that a second image appears. And you already guessed it, that's something I also already added. If I enable that and we go back, we see that this image is already there and there's some text, but now everything looks ugly, of course, but we can fix that. The first thing that still needs to happen though is that this main image should fade away, because now you see that the position sticky ends and that it just scrolls up. But before that happens, we actually want to fade this image out, because looking at CodeSandbox website, you see that it feels like one image kind of replaces the second one. So for that, we go back to our collaboration component. And in there, again, I already defined an animation to fade the image out. That animation takes in as a first argument 90% of the scroll. And that animation fades out the image from 1 to 0 opacity in the last 10% of the scrolling height. So with that, we can copy this animation and add that to our image as well. And if we then go back to our website, we see that once we scroll the last part, that the image fades out. It still scrolls a little bit away, but once the other image lies on top, you won't notice it anymore. So therefore, let's quickly add the animation to the next component so we don't see this ugly behavior happen anymore. If we open that section, you see that there's already quite a lot in here. And what's in here? Let's first go to the CodeSandbox website. Of course, this main image is in there, like you can see here. But there's also quite a bit of text, because as soon as you scroll, there's text on the left side, the right side, and then there's 2 branches created. So there's also 2 images. That's why there's a loading screen in here, and even more text, and then it scrolls away. All those different texts are something you see stacked on top of each other here. So that is something we're gonna animate next. And like I said just a minute ago, once you start getting components that become quite big, it can become quite a hassle to maintain all these different animations and get a proper overview or picture in your head about what's exactly happening here. So for that reason, instead of defining the scroll percentages in line, I'm actually going to show you a different approach right now that I like to take once components get a little bit bigger. And a little bit bigger in the sense of have a lot more animations and animation steps in between them. But in my opinion, this is kind of the biggest size you can go. From here, you really need to split things up to really have a proper overview of all of the different animations. So to start adding animations again, we need to copy in our useScroll hook and add the ref as well. So that's again the first thing we're gonna do. And of course, we need to add our ref to the section. Also notice that I added a height of 800 viewport height. And the reason for this is because we need to have quite a distance to scroll to be able to animate everything properly and not have you scroll just a little bit and be at the end of the section and everything is animated. Giving this a certain height, 800 viewport height in this case, gives us enough room to scroll. But that's something you also need to tweak a little bit to see what height makes the most sense for your current section. Before adding all of the animations, I think it's also good if we quickly take a look at the HTML structure of this section. The first thing that's in here is a sticky position div. That sticky section contains the main image, but also contains the main image again, as well as a loading screen. And the reason for that is, if we go to CodeSandbox website, in the final stage of this animation, you see two images next to each other. So that's why there's two columns inside this div, one containing the main image and the other one containing both the main image as well as a loading state, which you see if you scroll a bit further up. So that means that this sticky section contains both of these images as well as the text that's underneath them. Next to that, the sticky part also contains the last text that's visible. We scroll down, you see that there's one more text. And the reason that that's inside of the sticky div is that as soon as the sticky time is over, it will also scroll out of view. If we would do this with position fixed, it would be really hard to have the exact same time when the image moves out of view also be applied to the position fixed text. So that's why in this case, I decided to add that text inside the same wrapper. The last thing that's inside this div are two different texts that are shown next to the image when we scroll up a little bit. Okay, enough blah blah. Sorry if that was boring to you, but I thought it would be useful to also explain a little bit about the HTML structure. But for now, back to adding the animation. You remember I told you that this component was quite big and that I had a different approach for adding all of the different animation steps? Well, let me add something in that I think is very useful for this. What I did is I created an object called animation order. In here, you see a few properties. All of these properties resemble a certain state of the animation. So just like you define in the animation a value between 0 and 1, I do now exactly the same. However, all of these steps have a specific name. And based on that, I can reference them a little bit better, or at least when I look at a certain animation, I know exactly when it is running. And it's also easier to spot bugs. So in case of these bigger animations, I think it's good to use some structure like this. Because trust me, if you need to debug a large animation with a lot of those arbitrary numbers, it's really hard to spot a bug. But let's take it step by step. Let's start with the main image. And the first thing we need to do for that main image is, like you see here, it should fade in and then scale down. So for that again, I took quite some time to find out the best animation durations and sizes. And I came up with this opacity and scale. And this is also the first time that you see me using the values defined above. It's just exactly the same array with numbers. However, now I put in these values. And this way I can see that the initial state, which is 0, that would be recognizable, but also the fade in end state. So, because if I didn't have these variables, it would be a value of 0.15. However, right now, this kind of reads like a script of a movie where you can just see what happens at which time frame. So in this case, it fades in until the opacity fade in has ended. And when the branch is created, that's something you see in a second, it will start fading out again. And the same thing for the scale. Based on different parameters, it scales from 3 to 1 and then it goes from 1 to 0.5. Because when the loading screen has ended, it will show two images right next to each other, both in a scale of 0.5. So based on these values, I can pretty quickly see what happens when. So let's first add the opacity and the scale to our child element of the sticky div, which is this element. So that again becomes a motion.div. And then in there, I'm again gonna add the style for opacity and scale. And if we then go back again, we see that the image kind of fades in and scales down, but it's not at the right place. And there's also still quite some text here, which is annoying. So let's disable that for a minute. And also disable the second image for now. And then you see that the image scales down and fades in. That's correct. It's not positioned at the right place though. And the reason for that is because we're using scale, but I'm also using translate again. So since scale and translate are both added to the transform property, it will override this. And in this case, if I would only have the -50 on the Y, I could add this to the style like we did before as well. However, this case, I'm also gonna add a translate of X in a second, but it shouldn't be a specific value. It should actually be a calc that's actually calc of 50% minus a specific value. Because again, I'm using position absolute, left 50%, and then translate x over minus 50% to make sure that this element is positioned in the center again. However, framer motion cannot animate calc values. So we need to come up with something different for this. And I did a few things for this. The first one is to add in this scale. I added a class name in Tailwind that accepts a CSS variable instead of a hard-coded value. So this would create a transform of scale with that variable in there, if it would be CSS. And then Tailwind takes care of us adding multiple scales and transforms. Tailwind makes sure that it combines them for us. So in order to have this scale work, I should actually add a minus scale CSS variable. The only issue is that now there is a TypeScript error. And the reason for that is because framer motion does not recognize CSS variables as valid properties. And in their own documentations, they explain this is only useful if you're using TypeScript, that you need to cast this to an any, unfortunately, to be able to use the CSS variables. And because I hate any, and again, this is only useful if you're using TypeScript, I created a small function that actually makes sure that it adds the right typings. So feel free to look up this function. It doesn't do anything except setting some types and then still casting it to an any, but at least you get the auto-completion still. But apart from that, you can ignore this if you see it, especially if you don't use TypeScript, but now you know at least why it's in there. And now I've set this scale CSS variable. It is using that inside the scale of Tailwind. And if we then scroll down again, we see that the image scales up and fades in, and then scales down. There's one more thing we need to add to this image to have the animation look kind of the same as Code Sandboxes, and that's a movement on the x-axis as well. And again, there's been quite some trial and error to get this animation right, so that means that there's quite some steps involved here. You can go through them yourself and play with them and see how they change over time, but those are all of the different steps you need to get a proper animation and move this from the x-axis. So again, you can add the X on here. However, like I said, you cannot use a calc. And in this case, again, I want to have it centered, but with a specific offset. So in this case, it should be centered and then add 50% on top of that. So it's moved 50% to the right. So for that, I created a small helper class called translateX-centered-offset. And if we check the global CSS, we see that this creates a translateX, adds a calc of minus 50%, and then adds a CSS variable called x, and defaults to 0 in case you omit this variable. But this then will generate a class that adds a translateX of minus 50%, and then adds a specific x value to this. So in our case, if we go back and change this into a x variable, that would mean that it adds the x of, for example, 50% to our minus 50. So it makes it a little bit more complicated, but again, try to play around with it to see how it exactly behaves, and I hope it then does make sense. Because doing that, and we scroll down, we see that the image is kind of on the right side, and if we then keep on scrolling further down, it moves to the left, and then it goes to the center and scales down, and that is actually the moment where the other image should also appear on the right side. So this is also the moment where we need to add in the texts and the second image. So let's start with adding the second image. And that second image is then positioned at the bottom right, because again, this has a translate. And this second image now is not positioned at the right place, but that is because we still need to add the right translations and opacities and things like that. First step again is to convert this into a motion.div, so we can add these styles. And then also this image needs to have a specific opacity, scale, as well as a translate on the x-axis. And for that, I created 3 new variables. these three variables, set a specific opacity, X, and scale for this element. And perhaps now you already see all the different steps we're adding. You're hopefully noticing how valuable these named steps are, because I would get really lost otherwise. So if we then scroll down to the loading image, we can add the style tag on here as well, and then add the opacity, the scale, which is loading screen scale, and the X, which is loading screen X. And then, of course, TypeScript starts to complain again, and for that, we can use our handy dandy function. And if we then refresh, refreshing is most of the time a good idea with frame motion because it sets inline styles and you don't want those to stick around. And if we then scroll down, we see that something is not right because the image is already in the center and visible way before it should be. And that is because I added opacity here instead of the loading screen opacity. So right now, once we add that, we see that it's immediately gone. And if we quickly refresh as well, and then start scrolling down, we see that it fades in only at the moment when it should start scaling down. And that's actually the moment we want, because we should still show the loading screen as well. Right now, the main image is always visible and on top of the loading screen. So we are gonna add another variable that will define when this main image should be visible. That variable we are gonna call new branch opacity, and based on specific state, that should fade in or not. So this variable we can then use in a few places. The first one being this main screen that should become a motion.div, where we can then add the style opacity. And then already you see that the loading screen appears. And also if we go a bit bigger, you see that it fades in at the right time now. But we can also use that to show these texts at the right moment. First one is the second branch, which should also become a motion.span. And then also has a style where the opacity is the new branch opacity, as well as the branch name for the first branch. That also gets the opacity styles. And by adding those opacity styles as well, you see that once we scroll down, only then the texts become visible. But before we start scrolling down even further, there's a few more things we need to do, and that is making sure that the text on the left and right side becomes visible as well. So for those texts, I created 4 more transforms. And I told you, this is quite a big animation. But if we just look at them one by one, I think they are doable, because both of them have an opacity and a translate Y, which goes for the opacity from 0 to 1 back to 0. And the translate Y just moves them 40 pixels from the bottom to 0 and then 40 pixels up when they move out. And these two variables are then set as styles to happen at a specific time. So to add those, we need to enable the text at the bottom, and we should also turn them into a motion.p. Then on here, I'm gonna add the opacity, which is paragraph 1 opacity, as well as a Y variable, which is the paragraph 1 translate Y. To make TypeScript happy again, we wrap it in a custom function. And then we are gonna copy this style tag and also add it to the second element, but we should not forget to replace it with its own styles, or mainly its own timing. The styles are the same. And because I wanna have these texts in the center of the screen, I'm gonna use position fixed to have these fixed while the section is in view. So for that, we can also again add a position variable, which again makes the elements fixed if the position is smaller than 1, and otherwise it will become relative. So that way we can add those positions to our style tags for the paragraphs as well. And if we then refresh and start scrolling down, we see that the text appears at the right moment. And when it goes to the right, the other text appears and then it fades out again. And then our loading screen appears. Isn't that just beautiful? And by only going step by step at this, I hope you see that it is doable. But don't get me wrong, tweaking the animations takes so much time. And now we have this. There's only one text remaining, and that is this final text. That should only become visible once the last branch is visible and the other one is faded out. So for that, you can guess it already, I created 2 more animations. That's again an opacity as well as a position Y. So for that, we go to our text and turn this into a motion.p again. Same for this one. And then we add in the right styles. The opacity as well as the Y in a variable again, because it is position absolute and we want to have it centered. Once we do that, we see that nothing appears yet. And the reason for that is simply because we cannot scroll far enough. If we scroll up to our definition, we see that it's only the last 5% that this animation happens. So that means in order to see this text appear, we need to have something underneath it so our section can start scrolling out of the view. So let's enable this section. And if we then keep on scrolling, you see that this text appears and then it scrolls out of view. And then we get this next thing, which is really funky looking, but that is because there are some styles missing. Because looking at Code Sandbox's website, that should look like a square that pushes text through. And I'm not going to discuss how they created this effect. I replicated it, so look at the code, but it could be a video on its own, I think. But for now, we are only going to focus on the scale animation as well as the translate on the x-axis. So let's open up this component again. And then we are going to add in the useScroll and the useRef again. And then for this section, I've defined a few variables. The first one is the position X of the text. You see it moves from right to left. The second one is the opacity of the full section because everything fades in once it comes into view. The next one is a scale because this square scales down once you keep on scrolling. And then we also have a separate opacity for the border, and that's actually used to hide this border at a specific breakpoint. So first, let's add a ref again to our section, and then we're gonna convert this into a motion.section because this time we are also going to animate our section, or at least we're gonna add a few things to this. The first one is the opacity animation that counts for the full section. Everything should fade in. And if we already go to our section, quickly refresh, we see that the fade in already works. But next to that, I'm also adding a scale CSS variable as well as a opacity border CSS variable. The opacity border variable is used on the div that represents this border, because that way we can use the variable and fade in the opacity of the pseudo element. And since we can't add a style tag to the before element, I'm using a CSS variable to actually change this opacity also in an animated way. And next to that, we're setting the scale variable as well, also on the section, because there's a few child elements at the bottom that are actually using this scale to position itself. And the reason for that, you already see it happening a little bit, is because there is actually a black square to create this effect, but that also needs to scale up and down. So there's some funky CSS here to replicate that behavior, but that's why I'm defining a scale variable, because I need that to scale this thing up and down. But I think that's something that's beyond this video. We do still need to add the position X of the text though, so that moves from left to right. So let's quickly do that by taking these two texts. One is the white text, the other is the outline text. And that's also why they're area hidden, because the text is 3 times in the DOM. So these two are useless to screen readers. So that's why I decided to hide them. But we need to convert them first into a motion.p again, so we can add the styles. And if we then add the styles, that should contain the position of the x-axis, but also a -50 on the y again. And if we add that and refresh the page quickly, we already see that the text now moves from left to right. The only thing that's still visible is this text here, which is actually the final text that becomes visible once this square disappears. And that text, of course, has its own styling, both an opacity as well as a scale. So that means that we're going to go to this last paragraph and convert that into a motion.p as well. And then we're also going to add the style tag. In there, we add the opacity and the scale that we just defined, as well as the position X and Y to center it again. And once we do that, and we quickly give this a refresh, we see that the text, or if we go even further up, the whole section is faded out, then it fades in, scales down, the text moves from right to left, and then the final text appears. And scrolling even further down will also fade that out and scale it down again. And with that, there's 2 more sections that I want to show you, but are not part of this video, simply because I think it would be repetition. But definitely let me know in the comments below if you want to see more of this, or if you want me to highlight specific things, then I can absolutely make more videos about this. But let's quickly add in the other 2 sections and see how they look. Okay, let's scroll down. After this section disappears, a new image comes in view. It scrolls from right to left, and you see some text that fades in, fades out, and some overlays on the UI that also become visible. Then that image goes away, there's some text that appears, and then you see this section that actually scrolls over top of the previous one. So again, I think it's quite a bit of repetition, but definitely check out the code via the link in the description. You also find a link to the preview deployment there. And again, absolutely let me know in the comments what you thought about this video. If there's anything you'd like to see me explain more in depth or add a few more things. And also, if you want me to help you giving more tips and tricks, definitely check out the link to my Discord as well, where I'm able to help you during your day-to-day work as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. It helps me tremendously. And I hope to see you in the next one.